Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Chav Chet. Today's daf is dedicated in memory of Rabbi Dr. Raymond Harari, who inspired me to love learning Gemara in high school. He brought each case in Gemara to life, making the material engaging and relevant. He was a master teacher who cared deeply about his students and their growth. He was a true role model whose legacy will live on in the countless lives that he touched. Conclusion to his wife Vicky, a Hadran learner, and to the entire family. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Today's daf is sponsored also by Miri Kadosh in memory of her dear friend Yafa Bar Yitzchak Mazal, who passed away this morning. We're going to get started with the bottom of Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Bet. We're going to start. Our daf today is a complete unit of 7 laws that Rabbi Abba passed down, or sent actually. He was from Israel. We've seen a lot of this Shalchu Mitam. They sent halachot. They sent piskei din, halachic rulings. He sent halachic rulings about 7 topics. We'll see almost all of them. There's an issue of a machloket between him and others who didn't necessarily agree with him. And he sends these rulings to Babylonia. What we'll see at the end of the daf is that Mar Zutra said, we're going to hold like him. Mar Zutra, if I get it correctly. Yeah. Mar Zutra said, in the name of someone else, that we hold like Rabbi Abba and all these 7 rulings. And then we'll get a little sidetrack, which we'll finish up a bit of tomorrow. But for today, we're going to see 7 seemingly unrelated topics. One could try maybe to come up with a theory as to what the connection between them is. I did not do that, but we will see that the 5th one relates to our topic. And in fact, the 5th one is the only one that there's a bit of a debate about what exactly he said, what he meant by some ambiguous statement he made. And they're going to relate to, it's possibly one debate that we saw in our section, or a different debate that we saw that we kind of made mention of, but we'll see more later on Daf Kuf Lamed. So with that, we'll get started. Some of them are pretty short, and some of them are a little more complicated and long. Shalachle Rabbi Abba Rav Yosef Bar Chama. So these are all rulings he sent to Rav Yosef Bar Chama in Babylonia. And again, he was living in Israel, and he sends this ruling. Ha'omer lechavero avdi ganavta, v'hu omer lo ganavti. So let's go back to our Ruth and Naomi issues. Ruth is always the one who's doing the bad thing, or at least is accused of doing bad. So Ruth has a slave in her possession. And Naomi comes and says, you stole my slave. That's my slave. What's he doing in your house? And Ruth says, I didn't steal your slave. So mativo etzlecha. So Naomi says back to her, well then, if you didn't steal my slave, what is my slave doing in your house? Please explain yourself. So Ruth says, either, what do you mean? You sold it to me. That's what your slave is doing in my house. Or you gave me the slave as a gift. But Ruth continues and says the following. You don't believe me? Okay. If you want. Now, the law is, if you remember, before we even get to what Ruth says, the law is where's the slave right now? In Ruth's possession. So Ruth has the upper hand. However, she says the following, even though legally, until you can prove it, I keep the slave. However, she says, fine, you don't believe me, you have an issue. Well, I'll give you the opportunity to take an oath. And if you're willing to take an oath on the stand and swear that this slave is yours and you didn't give it to me as a gift, you didn't sell it to me, fine, I'll give it back. I'll give you back the slave. Now, Ruth doesn't have to do this, okay? But she's offering something to the other side. So now, there's 2 ways to read this next line they're both of the same idea. Okay, we're going to see that Ruth can't change her mind. The question is, at what point can she change her mind? Okay, now, part of the issue is, we're not sure when Ruth said, Ritzon Chai Shava V'tol, Naomi, if you're really fine, you don't believe me, so take an oath and take it. Now, since she doesn't have to do this by law, it's possible that Ruth is just trying to call Naomi's bluff, and she doesn't really mean it. And if Naomi actually gets up and takes an oath, and that's the logic, the lashon we're going to see right now. Vinishba, if Naomi gets up and takes the oath, Ruth can't get up and say, okay, she can't say, oh, I didn't really mean that. I didn't really think you were going to take the oath. Okay, once she takes the oath, it's too late. Okay, there's no turning back. Some people move the vav in Vinishba, and their version moves the vav to the next word, Eino. Now, moving one little letter makes a huge difference. So let's read it that way. Nishba ve'eno yachol lachzor bo. Naomi can take an oath and Ruth can't change her mind. Now, what does this mean? Well, if we talk about a timeline, there's the moment when, right, the slave, they start arguing about it. That's the moment right now. Then there's the moment Ruth says, oh, you really want? Fine, take the oath and take it. The question is, at that point, is it a point of no return? According to the second version, it's a point of no return, because what it's telling you is the law is Naomi can take an oath, not vinishba. If she takes the oath, then it's too late. That's already a later time. That's the first reading. Only later, after the oath is already taken, it's too late. But if Ruth wanted to change her mind before that, she could say, oh, I didn't really mean what I said. It wasn't really serious. But once Naomi takes the oath, it's too late. According to the second reading, no. It's too late as soon as Ruth gives her that option. Once she gives her the option, she can't change her mind anymore. And that's the option, nishba ve'eno yachol lachzor bo, right? Nishba meaning Naomi can take the oath, and Ruth can change her mind and claim, oh, I didn't really mean what I said. Now, let's not get too caught up on the two different readings, but it is interesting, and I like to point those things out when you could just move one letter and it changes everything. But again, it doesn't change everything, because either which way, there is a point where Ruth can't change her mind. And that's really what we're interested in, the big picture. So now, the issue here is, even though Ruth offered Naomi to take this oath that was not obligated by law for her to do it, once she does it, or once Ruth takes the oath, it's too late, and Ruth can't change her mind. My kamashmalan. So now they're saying, well, what is Rabbi Abba teaching us? There's an explicit Mishnah that talks about this in Sanhedrin. Tanina. And this is when we talk about relatives, and we're going to discuss that a little bit today in general, about who can't testify, who's not a good, can't testify, who can't be a judge. Now, if two people are in judgment together, they're up against each other, and one says to the other, Ne'eman alai Abba, Ne'eman alai Avicha, Ne'emanim alai shlosha ro'ei bakar. Basically, without getting into all the details of this case, one side says to the other, you know what? I don't really care. I just want to have this judgment. I don't care if your father's the judge. I don't care if my father's the judge. I don't care if we have Sulei Dayanim here, people who can't be judges. I don't care if we have 3 Ro'e Bakar, that's 3 shepherds. Now, shepherds generally are not considered knowledgeable people. They lived out in the fields. They weren't people of the book. Even if they're not knowledgeable Dayanim, I have no problem with that, okay? So if both sides agree to it, or one side said, let's say it's the other guy's father, your father can judge me. I have no problem. I'm not worried about him being biased against me. Once he agrees to that, now we have a machloket. Can he change his mind about this? So Rabbi Meir Omer yachol lachzor bo, because this is not a law, because this is not accepted lahalacha in general. If the person says, I'll allow this to go through, but then says, oh, you know what, I don't want your father to be the judge, so that person can change their mind. But chachamim omrim eino yachol lachzor bo. The rabbis say no. Even though this isn't the law is that if you accept something that's not the law, you can't change your mind about it. Once you accepted it, you accepted it. And therefore, that's no different than what Rabbi Abba is saying. If you accepted that the other person could take an oath and take this slave from your hands, if Ruth said, I don't mind, fine, take an oath, take the slave, even though she's definitely not obligated to do that. And usually, we wouldn't take an oath in this case. So, right, she wouldn't have the luxury to be able to take an oath and collect it. She really wouldn't be able to collect it until she brings witnesses. Yet, once it's done, you can't change your mind. So that's no different than the rabbis, really. So what's this coming to teach you? So what Rabbi Abba is coming to teach you, the Gemara says is, ha-kamashmalan, and this is a whole subject of debate when we learn this Mishnah in Sanhedrin, we'll get there, in the 3rd chapter, there's a big machloket, is when the rabbis say you can't change your mind, are they talking about, there's 2 types of cases. The case could be where the person who said, I'm willing to do something that's, I'm willing to let your father be the judge. Let's just take that one. That's the easiest case. I'm willing to let your father be the judge. Now, the question is, let's say it's me saying that, or Ruth. Okay, let's put Ruth back in that position. If she's got a fight with Naomi, and Naomi's trying to take money out of Ruth's hands, and Ruth says, I agree that let's do Machulacha first, okay? Let's say Naomi is owed money is claiming that Naomi has something in her possession that Ruth is trying to take. Okay? Now, if Ruth says your father could be the judge, that's fine. And I'll believe him if he says that item is yours, and then everything stays status quo, right? That's an easier ruling, right? To say, well, once Ruth says that, it's accepted because anyway, right? We're just keeping the status quo. But if it's like our case, where Ruth is trying to get, right, where Naomi's trying to take something out of Ruth's hands, the opposite case, where Ruth now is going to lose and have to pay something to Naomi. You might say in that case, since anyway, this wasn't a legal thing, and Ruth was just accepting something that wasn't legal or wasn't required by law, right? In one case, it's not legal because the father can't be the judge. In the other case, it's not required by law, but it's one and the same. Then maybe you would say that in that case, the rabbis allow lachzorbo, right? But they would say, oh, well, since it's going to change the status quo, and we usually say, leave the item where it is, and whoever wants to take the money has to prove it, maybe Ruth could actually change her mind about this. So you have to understand, etain lecha is, I will give to you. That's already more of a stretch to say the rabbis say you can't change your mind. It's a done deal. Machul lecha, oh, I'll let it go. I'll just leave things as they are, is much easier. So in Sanhedrin, there's a big machloket. Is it etain lecha? Is the machloket between the rabbis and Rabbi Meir about etain lecha or about machul lecha? So what Rabbi Abba is teaching us here is that he holds it's even etain lecha because that's our case. That once Ruth commits to something, it doesn't matter if it means the money is going to leave her property, right? That she's going to have to pay out. Still, once she commits to it, or once Naomi actually takes the oath, either which way, it's at a certain point, Ruth can't change her mind about it. That's the whole chidush of what Rabbi Abba is telling us. That was one of the more complicated ones. Now we're going to a very simple one. Shalach le Rabbi Abba le Rav Yosef bar Chama. Halacha govim min ha'avadim. Rav Nachman amar ein govim. So here we see another machloket. Right there, by the way, there was no machloket. It's just you know that there's a machloket about this issue because some people think it's only a machul lecha. Okay, that's basically right. And then etain lecha, Ruth would be able to change her mind. But in this case, the Gemara tells us explicitly what the machloket is, although we're going to see at the very end of today's daf, perhaps this really isn't a machloket at all. But according to our reading right now, and I won't confuse you with what's going to come at the end of the daf, the halacha is, now what are we talking about? We need some background here. Orphans, when they inherit their father's estate, and their father has some loans outstanding, when people come to collect the loans, they can only collect them from land. Okay, if the orphans have no land, they can't collect it. However, we're going to see that according to Rabbi Abba, the halacha is slaves, Canaanite slaves, are considered like land. Now, this comes from a pasken in the Torah, you can pass them on in inheritance, like land. So slaves are treated like land. Now, Rav Nachman disagrees. Not that he doesn't go by that pasuk. It's true, slaves are like land, but not for this purpose. He says, for this purpose, it's not. Okay, for other things, yes. For this, no. Meaning that you can't collect loans from the father. If, let's say, the orphans only have slaves and no land, you can't collect the loan. Next halacha, third. Shalach le Rabbi Abba le Rabbi Yosef bar Chama. Halacha shlishi b'sheni kasher. Okay, now we talk about relatives. And there's 3 generations generally when we talk about relatives. You could get to 4 also, but basically let's just start with Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Now, Reuven has kids, Shimon has kids. Reuven and Shimon are considered first generation relatives. For sure, you can't testify one for the other. Second generation relatives are the first cousins, the sons of Reuven, the sons of Shimon. You can use your own family if you want. It's usually easier to understand it in the context of your own family. So cousins. Cousins can't testify for each other either. And cousins can't testify for the first generation because cousins are all close to their uncles, right? And therefore, uncles, cousins can't testify, uncles, nephews, right, can't testify for each other. But when you get to the third generation already, things start, right? The connection between, and this goes on in every family, right? The connection between brothers is usually pretty close, assuming you get along. Connection between their children is somewhat close. But already you get to the third generation, they're already distant. And not only are they distant from each other, because they're second cousins, right? We already, even just by calling them first cousins, second cousins, you already know they're more distant. But it's also that the second cousins, who are the third generation, are already somewhat distant from the second generation, right? And if you imagine a family tree, it's the way it looks, right? The first generation, they're very close. As you go down, people get farther away from each other on the family tree, which is also an indicator they get farther away from each other in terms of relationships. Now, in theory, you would say, just like, right, cousins are close with each other, but usually the uncle is even closer with the cousin than with the nephew than the cousins are with each other sometimes, because they feel this connection through their brother, right? And they feel very close and they're connected. Now, when we get to the next generation already, there's even less connection. So shlishi b'sheni means, okay, in simple terms, that a cousin, okay, first cousins with, so the first cousins who are cousins through Reuven and Shimon, Reuven's grandchildren basically are allowed to testify for Shimon's children. Okay, that's what it means. Or Shimon's children can testify for Reuven's grandchildren, okay, or any kind of combination there, where a second generation relative of one brother can testify for a third generation of the other brother. Okay, so basically, if you want to say it in other terms, Shimon's great nephew can, right, or anyone's great nephew can testify for their children, for that person's children. The great uncle's children can testify for the great nephews. Okay, now that's what Rabbi Abba says. Rava Amar Af Barishon. Rava says, forget that. No, Reuven and Shimon themselves probably have a little bit of a closer connection. They're the great uncle. So they're even closer because, again, the closer you get to the first generation, right, that's where the closeness is the closest. Reuven and Shimon feel close to each other. And therefore, Reuven will feel a closeness to Shimon's grandchildren, more so than Reuven's children will. Okay, that's the second generation, right? Or I can't remember who I was saying, but Shimon, let's say, will feel the closest with Reuven's grandchildren because he's got this closest to Reuven. Comes Rav and he says, nah, even that's not so close. So Shimon himself can testify for his great nephews. And that's pretty simple. And the great nephews can testify for their great uncle. Rabbi Abba thinks, no, they can't. Mar Rav Ashi goes even farther to say, Mar Rav Ashi, Aksha Abba de Abba. Mar Rav Ashi says, oh, first and third generation? Oh, first and third means even? Until now, we keep saying Reuven to Shimon, right? Reuven is first, Shimon is first, right? And then one to the other's second, one to the other's third, okay? But now we're going to say Reuven can testify for his own grandchildren. That's already distant. That's a little bit crazy, but which is what the Gemara says. But later, clearly they'll hold by him because that's his own children who gave birth to their children. No, within your own family, of course. Here we're only talking about brothers, right? The connection to your brother's children. Okay, so that's a three-way debate there about the relatives. Which relatives can testify for who? Next halacha, 4. Shalach le Rabbi Abba le Rabbi Yosef bar Chama. Haya yodea lo be'edut karka ad shelo nistame v'nistame pasul. Let's start with a basic law. A blind person cannot testify about something because you have to see testimony. So if you can't see it, you can't testify. So if, let's say, a murder took place, a blind person is not accepted to say who did it because they can't see. What if you were blind, you became blind after you saw the murder? So you can come forward and testify. I know that I saw, you know their name, you know what they look like, right? You say, this is the person that murdered that person. Okay, you wouldn't be able to identify them in the lineup. You're blind, but assuming you know who the person is, you know who their name, you know everything, and you want to testify about them, even though now you're blind, we accept your testimony, theoretically, maybe we would, and that's really a question. We'll get to this later. But because you saw it when you were not blind, maybe there you could testify. But here we're talking about land. Now, when it comes to land, we're testifying about the boundaries of land. Now, when you come to testify about it, you have to say, here are the boundaries. At this point, you can't see. So even though you knew exactly where this person's boundaries were, at this point, you can't see, and therefore you can't testify about it. So if you knew this edut karka before you became blinded, then you became blinded, you can't testify about it. But Shmuel is going to disagree with this. Shmuel Amar, Kashel, Efshar de Mechave Mitzanina. You can give landmarks and say, oh, the border on the east was right where this happened. There's a pile of rocks there. You can come up with landmarks that define it, where you don't actually have to see it to be able to say it. And this is what we call, it's kind of like the language of Bava Metzia, of finding lost items, of simanim, right? There's identifying markers that you could identify even without being able to see. So he accepts that even though Rabbi Abba doesn't. Rav Sheshan Amar filu glima. Oh, sorry, aval glima lo. But comes, okay, each one's going to go take it one step farther than the previous. But Shmuel says, not if you're talking about a cloak, that you have to be able to see, to be able to identify, is this the cloak that belongs to so-and-so? Rav Sheshan Amar Filu Gliman, Shard Machavim Midat or Ko Midat Rochbo. You could say, I know it was exactly, thank you, Becky, for pointing out. That's right, Rav Sheshan was blind. Even a cloak, you can say how long it was, how wide it was. You remember the dimensions, and you can basically explain based on dimensions. Aval naskalo, but not a bar of silver. There's no real way to identify it. Rav Papa Amar Filu Naska, Shard Machavim Midat Mishkalotav. It goes by weight. You could say, I know that silver bar weighed this amount, and therefore you can identify it by weight. So each of them think that there's a way to do this. Now we're going to bring a difficulty from a Braita against the three opinions that say there is a way to do it. Now, people are disqualified for all different reasons from being a witness. One reason could be you're a relative. Another reason could be that you're blind or deaf, which we call a cheresh in the halacha, which is usually a deaf mute. You can't speak and you can't hear. And usually that's considered someone we assume doesn't have da'at, doesn't have knowledge. It's a big question. Okay, if you want to go back and hear Alana Steinhain's shiurim about the cheresh shoteh katan, you'll find it on our site, to the great sidra about all these categories and how we view them in modern times. Or so someone blind, someone who's deaf mute, or someone who's a shoteh, right? Which again is a hard thing to define, right? Someone who doesn't have their mental facilities working properly. Again, you can listen to Alana's shiur about how exactly we define that. Again, there's no exact, it's debatable what exactly it is, as we know about everything. So now, someone knew testimony before they became the father-in-law of this person. So they knew something about this person that they could testify about, something that happened. But then they became their father-in-law. At this point, when it comes time to testify, they're related. So they weren't related before, now they are. Or they were pikach, they were fine, and then they cheresh, and then they became a deaf mute. Or pitach v'nistameh, or they could see, and then they became blind. Or shafoy v'nishtata, where they were fine, and then they became a shoteh. So, pasul, they can't testify at this point because now they're not, okay, they can't. Aval, haya yodea lo be'edut ad shelo nasa chatano. But if you knew testimony before, then you became the father-in-law, v'nasa chatano, you became the father-in-law, umei tabito, and then the daughter dies, and then you're no longer connected. So now we're going to have all the cases where you were okay when you saw the testimony, then you weren't able to testify, but then you were again. Or pikach v'nitcharesh v'chazar v'nitpakach. Something happened, you got sick and you couldn't speak or hear, but now you can. Or pitach v'nistameh v'chazar v'nitpatech. Weren't blinded, you're right, you were blinded temporarily, then you weren't anymore. Shafoy v'nishtata v'chazar v'nishtafa, same thing with the shoteh. Kashir, then you can. Okay, that's the ruling. It's not exactly connected with our case yet because our case is kind of unique where you can give simanim, okay? Here we're talking about something where you would have to identify something and you wouldn't be able to testify when you're blind or, you can't speak or all that. Now, the issue is that in that source, it then says, Zeh haklal, this is the rule. Now, whenever it says this is the rule and the rule is pretty obvious, well, why are they telling you this is the rule? And the assumption is this is the rule, which is going to repeat exactly what we just said, just in a rule form, must be coming to add something else. And what's it coming to add? If not, well, even if you can identify it by identifying marks without being able to see it, it still doesn't work. And that goes against the three rabbis who thought that it could work in certain cases. That's basically their difficulty, and the Gemara is actually not going to have a resolution. So let's read this out, which you can already figure out. If either when you saw the testimony or when you want to give the testimony, you're one of those people who are pasul to testify, disqualified, well then you're disqualified. You can't testify, either the beginning or the end. Right? We only saw cases where it was at the end, right? And all the cases we brought, you were actually when you saw the testimony. But obviously, if when you saw the testimony, you were a relative or you were in one of these categories where you can't testify, well, then of course it's not going to be good. But if in the beginning and at the end, we don't care what happened in the middle. If in the beginning, when you saw the testimony, and now when you want to testify, you're fine, then you can testify. So again, that's really unnecessary. Therefore, it must be coming to teach something new, like what we just said against all these rabbis. And they say tiyufta tekulu tiyufta. Now moving to Amud Bet, this difficulty is actually a difficulty against all the opinions. That was number 4. Now we're moving to number 5. Shalach Rabbi Abba Rav Yosef Brachama. Now I told you number 5 is our case. Ha'omer al tinok ben habanim ne'eman. If you say about a child among sons, you are believed. This doesn't really mean anything, okay? Or it means something, but it's very, very unclear what he meant. What does it mean? If you say about a child among sons, you're believed, what could that possibly mean? So and Rabbi Yochanan says, Eino ne'eman. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rabbi Abba. Again, we have a machloket here. He says, you're not believed. Okay, my kamar, what on earth was he saying? So Amar Abai, we're going to have machloket Abai and Rava what this is. And as I mentioned before, when I said that we're going to get to our case and why this is in our sugya here, is because it's going to connect to two sugyas that have to do with, it potentially connects with one or two sugyas that we've been discussing. Amar Abai, hachi kamar. Abai says this is what he's saying. Ha'omer al tinok ben abanim yirash kol nechasai ne'eman. If you say about one son among all your sons is going to inherit all my possessions. Now, this is language of inheritance, not gift. Gift would be a different story. You can gift to anyone you want your stuff. But if you say, right, that's how we override these basic laws of inheritance, but the Torah laws of inheritance. But if you say language of Yerusha, you're inheriting, it has to go to your heirs and the ones who are first in line. But let's say you have 5 sons and you say, I want only one of my sons to inherit all of my possessions. You can do that. Okay, so you can't give it to a daughter or to a brother, but you can have one of the sons to the exclusion of all the others. And you're believed to say that. Ki Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka that we'll see on Daf Kuf Lamed. We made reference to it earlier, but it's going to be on the Mishnah Kuf Lamed. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Eino ne'eman ki Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan says you can't do that. Because the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka there and say, what do you mean? You're going against what the Torah says. The Torah says it's divided equally among all your sons. And the Torah doesn't exactly say that, but the Torah seems to mean that. And therefore, you're not believed. Now, so I see that, Tina, you're asking, why are they using the language of tinok? And it's going to work a lot better according to Rava. And another language doesn't really work here. I don't know if you pick that up, but we'll see right now. Matkiv la Rava. Hi ne'eman ve'eno ne'eman. Why does it say you're believed, you're not believed? This isn't an issue of believability. This isn't, are you trusted to do this? No, is it effective or not? Yirash velo yirash me'bayale. It should have said that the Rabbi Abba says you can that one son can inherit, and Rabbi Yochanan says no, that son can't inherit. By the way, don't get confused between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Rabbi Yochanan is an Amora in Israel who's dealing with this Tanaitic debate. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is a Tana who's arguing with the rabbis in a Mishnah that we'll see on Daf Kuf Lamed. So Rabbi Yochanan Dafka doesn't hold by Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. So basically what Rav is saying is if we go with your interpretation, you're right, Tina, that the tinok doesn't really fit either. Tinok ben abanim, it should be ben abanim and not tinok ben abanim. And this ne'eman eno ne'eman doesn't make any sense. It's not an issue of you believed or trusted or not. So Ella Amar Rava says, Hachi Kamran. This is why it's in our sugya, because it relates to what we learned yesterday and where we finished. Ha'omer al tinok ben abanim b'cholhu ne'eman ki Rabbi Yehuda. That whole issue of when the father comes, when we think that the oldest is the oldest, what we know to be the oldest, there's a chazaka, and the father comes along and says the tinok, the younger one in the family, is actually the older one, which then explains why it's the language of tinok, right? Because either he's saying those aren't my children, or maybe he's saying you think he's the youngest, but he's really older than all the other sons. You have in families, right? It happens often where one sibling looks a lot older than the other, even though they're not. So for whatever reason, there was confusion about it, and he says he's the Bechor, he's Ne'eman, he's believed, and that's Ki Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Abba holds like Rabbi Yehuda in that debate, and Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eino Ne'eman Ki Rabbanan, and that's what we saw yesterday. The rabbis say, no, we don't believe the father when there's chazaka. We only believe the father when we have no idea who's oldest, the father's believed. But if we have a presumption of who we presume to be the oldest, and the father comes and says something against that, we don't believe the father. So that's the debate between, again, there's a debate within the debate. What is this debate? Abai thinks it's a debate between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and the rabbis that we're going to see on Daf Kuf Lamed. Rabbi thinks it's the machloket we saw on yesterday's Daf. Next halacha, 6. Okay, this is the one. This one's very simple, and the next one's going to be complicated. Shalach le Rabbi Abba le Rabbi Yosef bar Chama. Ha'omer titol ishti ke'echad min habanim. This has to do with Yerusha, but not anything we learned so far. If you remember, a wife doesn't inherit the husband. But what if the husband says, I want my wife to inherit just like one of my sons? So it means if I have 3 sons, we're going to divide the property. Okay, let's just assume, I don't know, firstborn. Let's just take the firstborn off the table. We're going to divide, there's 3 sons. We're going to divide into 4 to include my wife, and she'll get a portion just like all the other sons. No teleke rabbanim. She does. This is effective. But it only works because right, it's not laws of Yerusha. He's giving it to her as a gift. Well, what are the criteria of a gift? Remember, Amarava u'b'nechasim shalach shav. This only works for the possessions he owns right then at the time, meaning it only if he says it today on October 31st, and then he dies 5 months later or 10 years later, any possessions that came into his property after the fact, after this gift was given, are not valid. So even though it's only going to take effect the day he dies, she'll only get from the possessions that were in his possession that day because you can't pass on something that isn't in existence yet. So if it's not his, he can't pass it on. Rava adds another thing. Let's say there were 3 sons right now. So she would get 1/4. Again, ignoring the firstborn issue. She would get 1/4. But what if there's another 2 sons born later? So even though the gift is given now, and theoretically, right, it goes on what he owns now, but in terms of how many parts do we divide it and what portion does she get of the husband's property, we don't say since at the time there were 3 sons, you get 1/4, and then we'll divide the rest of it evenly among all the sons that are left. No, if later there's 5 sons or 6 sons, whatever, we're going to divide it into 7 portions. You're only going to get a 7th. Okay, so that's because what he said is you're going to be like one of the sons. So even though the sons aren't born yet, when they're born, at the time we divide it, right, she's going to get a portion like with them included. Okay, the 7th case is quite complicated because we're going to make reference to some other total different machloket, and it's a little bit complicated, so bear with me. Shalach le Rabbi Abba le Rav Yosef bar Chama. Hamotzi shtar chova chavero. So Ruth pulls out an IOU to Naomi and says, you owe me money. Milva Omer, or maybe it should be Naomi because she's usually the good one who's not. So I don't know. Let's keep it as I said. Ruth pulls out. There's no real good or bad here. So we're just going to say Ruth has a shtar chov, an IOU that Naomi owes her money. Milva Omer. So Ruth says, Lo nifrati klum. You didn't pay me anything and give me all the money, which usually she's believed because the shtar is in her hand. Lova Omer parati mechze. The Lova says, Naomi says, what do you mean I paid you half? Now, what's that called? Modeh b'miktzah, right? She claims she owes half. So what does you need to do? The modeh b'miktzah law is if you admit to half a claim but not the whole claim, what do we assume? We assume that you just don't have the money right now. You're pushing things off. And what are you doing basically? You're saying, this is the concern anyway. I'm really intending to pay back the whole thing, but I don't have the money now. So what will I do? I'll just claim I owe you half. I'll deal with the other half later. I'll bring it to you later. And then I'll reopen the whole thing. And when I get the money, I'll say, oh, by the way, I really do owe you the whole thing. But why aren't you lying about the whole thing if you're already lying, right? Well, you're embarrassed in front of someone who did a nice thing for you and loaned you money. So you would never be brazen enough to lie completely in front of someone. So that's why you admitted to half. But we really think that you really owe the whole thing. And that's why we're going to make you take an oath. We assume if you're really lying, you won't lie under oath. But if you do swear under oath, then you'll be exempt from the half. Okay, so that's our idea here of a modeh b'miktzah. But in this case, something else happened. Later, witnesses came. Ha'edim mi'idim shapara kulo. Witnesses came and said that Naomi paid back the entire loan. It's a little strange. So, but the Lova admitted that she still owes half. Okay, Naomi admitted to owing half, even though the witnesses are against her. Now, and help her. They're not really against her, but they're saying something different from what she said. So what's the law here? Now, since Naomi admitted that she owed half, so she swears, takes an oath that she paid back half the loan, and Ruth can collect the other half based on her oath. This is what we call a hoda'at ba'al, right? Even though the witnesses eventually came they obviously came before any money moved hands. The witnesses came and said, Naomi doesn't know anything, but Naomi admitted she owed, so we can make Naomi pay. However, and this is part of what's confusing here is we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent about what kind of property can Ruth collect this from. That's not germane to our issue, but it is a point that we're going to make, but then we'll come back to our issue. So she's gova mechze, Ruth can get half, minechasim b'nei cholin, only for property that's free. What does it mean free? It means property that's in Naomi's possession at the time. But she can't go. Let's say Naomi has nothing left. She sold all her property, but she sold it after the loan was taken out. So Ruth can generally go to Naomi's buyers, purchasers who purchase land from Naomi and collect the loan. In this case, not. Why not? So the Amre, because those purchasers who bought this lien property and knew it was lien to a loan, but they can claim Anana Edim Samchinan. There's witnesses that said that Naomi paid back her loan. So we're going to rely on those witnesses, and until you can prove otherwise, right? Your only proof that Naomi didn't pay back the land is Naomi's admission. That can't make us responsible to give up this land. Now, there's a few reasons given here, and I think it's very interesting to think about. First of all, one concern is that maybe Naomi wants her land back, and maybe she's in a konunya conspiracy with Ruth, to basically get her land back. So she figures, she gives back the document to the IOU to Ruth. Ruth says, "Oh, look, you owe me money," and then she'll say, "Oh, I only owe you half," so that it looked like there was some real whatever going on here. And then they'll be able to get half the loan back, half the land, that amount of land, and they'll split it 50-50 between them. So that's number one concern, why the buyers could say, no way, no how. We have witnesses that say she paid it back, we're good. But even if you're not worried about a konunya, let's say it was clear there's no konunya going on. I don't know how you could be clear, but let's say there's another reason. The only thing we have to make Naomi pay this money is her own admission. Now, we say that hoda'ah ba'al din k'mei edim dami. Hoda'ah, an admission of someone, is like 100 witnesses. So it's very strong. But not bimkom shachav la'acharim, not if it causes an obligation for somebody else. Your own admission can obligate you 100%, but it can't obligate somebody else because it's just an admission. Maybe you're doing it because you hate that person and you want to make them suffer. Who knows? So therefore, her admission can only work for her, but not for any purchasers. And that's why it can only be collected from Nechasim B'nei Chomim. But I want you to put that whole issue aside now. Okay, we're done with that issue of the Meshuabadim, which is a drop complicated, but I want you to put that aside. Now, the main thing here that we learned so far that we're going to deal with is that Rabbi Abba says this is a modeh b'miktzah case. Okay, and now we're going to see that it's debatable whether this is modeh b'miktzah because there's an exception to the rule where you don't have to take an oath. And that's called, okay, we'll go back to a very basic law. If I find a lost item on the street and I want to give it back to you, and then, but you claim that, let's say I found, say I found two animals, okay? Or you claim I found two animals that both are yours. And I claim, no, one of them is mine and one of them is yours. Okay, so that's a modeh b'miktzah case, but about an aveda, about a lost item. Now, if I go to return you your cow and you say, but the other cow's mine also, and I say, only this one's mine, only this one's yours, the other one's mine, so I don't have to take a shvuah in that case. That's not a modeh b'miktzah. Why? It is a modeh b'miktzah because you're claiming I owe you two cows and I say I only owe you one. But because it was a lost item that I found, mishum tikkun olam, the videos of tikkun olam, remember we learned all those sugyot tikkun olam? We don't make me take an oath. Why is that? Because next time I'll say it's not worth my effort to go, like here I was trying to do you a favor and I found your animal wandering and I want to return it and you're making me take an oath in court? Thanks, but no thanks. Next time I just won't pick up an animal that I find on the road. I won't take an animal on the road. So therefore, we basically say any case of Meshiv Aveda, returning a lost item, there's no oath of modeh b'miktzah, even if it's a modeh b'miktzah case. What does that have to do with anything? Well, we're going to see a case right now where there's a machloket about whether we call this Meshiv Aveda or not. So it's not in the Gemara, it's in the Rashbam. He quotes it. So let's read them. It's very hard because the Gemara doesn't even quote the whole machloket. So if you look in the Rashbam, at least by me, it's not bolded. So it's bolded by Avalomi Meshabde, and then it's on the next line. Plukta to Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar betchilat shnayim ochsin. Okay, we learned this in the beginning of Bava Metzia. Shtar shekatu bo slaim o dinavlim. If Ruth pulls out a document that says, Naomi, you owe me slaim or you owe me dinavlim, doesn't say how many. Now the assumption is what is slaim? It's plural, so it means two at least. Okay, but we don't know how many because it didn't say two. It just said Rabim, which we assume at least minimally is two. But in this case, what happened? Mava Omer Chamesh. Ruth says you owe me 5. The loan was out for 5 because it didn't say how many. So she says, right, it was 5. This is why on checks, right, you have to make sure all the amounts are filled in because someone could just fill in some other amount, right? Here it's like a blank check almost. The Lova Omer Shalosh. The Lova says it was 3. Now, notice the Lova didn't say 2, which the Lova could have said. That would have gotten the Lova out of everything, right? Because the basic is 2. Now the argument is about 3 or 5. Now this is also motive b'miktzah because she agreed to one of the, there's only 3 under debate here, from numbers 3, 4, and 5. She agrees about the third. She doesn't agree about 4 and 5. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, who ilvoda b'miktzah Tana Yishava. He called this a motive b'miktzah. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. However, Rabbi Akiva says, "Eino ela kemishiv aveda patur mishvuah." This slaim, and as he says, this is meshiv aveda because slaim sounds like 2, and in fact, we learned this just recently. Tafasta meruba lo tafasta, right? If you go too much, you don't, right? You go overboard, and usually it means something else. But here it means we always assume the minimum, so we assume this is 2, which means that when the lova, even though the malva said 5, they have a star that says 2. So if the lova says anything more than 2, that's like returning a lost item because it's something Ruth would never have gotten back in a million years. So the fact that she's agreeing to give it to her, that third one, means that she's returning a lost item, which means what? There's no oath. So Rabbi Akiva would say there's no oath in that case. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? The debate we're going to see between Rabbi Abba and the others is this a case of Meshiv Aveda? Because what happened here? Witnesses said that the Lova paid, that Naomi paid everything back. So when Naomi is now going to pay half, right? She's basically like Meshiv Aveda, or maybe not. Okay, that's the question. So comes Rabbi Abba and says, "Afilu the Rabbi Akiva da'amar Meshiv Aveda have." Even Rabbi Akiva, who says as your Meshiv Aveda, hanimile hecha deleka edim. That's only because there were no witnesses in that case that said anything. But hecha deika edim, and you would think edim would support the fact that it's Meshiv Aveda because the edim said that that Naomi paid back all the money, which would all the more so make it a Meshiv Aveda case. Comes Rabbi Abba and says, no. What happened here? The edim, if you remember, came after Naomi's admission. So what does that mean? Since they came after her admission, we assume that Naomi knew there were witnesses coming before she admitted. Now, if you know witnesses are coming, even if you knew they were coming to support you, you never really know what they're going to say when they get to court. And maybe she was scared that they were going to say that she owed the whole thing. So she said, I owe half, to kind of protect herself, that she doesn't look like she's ignoring an entire amount. Remember also that Ruth has the document in hand. So it could be she was scared what the witnesses were going to say. Maybe she had no idea what they were going to say. Maybe she thought they might say that she owed all the money. So it could be that because there were witnesses coming, she basically admitted to part of the claim. And then again, that leads us to maybe she's actually lying completely, right? Maybe she's lying about the part that she paid back. And therefore, it's like a classic moda b'mitzvah because we're suspect of her. But if there were no witnesses coming and she just admitted to something that there was no way she was going to have to pay, well, then that's Meshiv Aveda, but that's not this case. That's basically what he says. But now, Matkafa Mar Ashi. Mar Ashi says the opposite. Adraba, I would say the complete opposite. Afilu the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, the Amar Modim Mitzad Tanavi. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, in the case of the Slaim, right, even that is a Modim Mitzad. Okay? Now, there were no witnesses there. Why is that? Right? That's when there's no edim that support the claim. And that's why you have to take an oath. Right there were no edim to support how many slaim it was. But in this case, he doesn't care that the witnesses came later. In the end, the witnesses said that Naomi owes nothing. There's witnesses coming to prove that she's totally innocent. If that's the case and she admits to half, we're not suspect that she's lying because there's edim on her side. Okay? In the case of the money, we're suspect that she's lying because really maybe it was 5 slaim and she's just saying 3. And that's why he requires an oath. But here, it's really Meshiv Aveda because all the testimony, again, he doesn't care that the testimony happened before or after. That's not relevant. The fact that in the end there's witnesses that can say she paid back the entire thing, the fact that she's saying I still owe you half is mamash like returning a lost item, even according to the one who doesn't think so in the other case. So they each have extreme positions. In other words, we have Rabbi Abba on the one hand who thinks that Rabbi Akiva there who thinks it's like returning a lost item. Here we're definitely not say that. And then we have Rabbi Shimi Lazar who says specifically the opposite. And they both use the Adim card, but to the opposite way. The first one uses the Adim card saying, because Adim were coming, that scared her into thinking that, I better admit something, even though maybe she really owes the whole thing. Not really caring that the Adim said the opposite, but it's the fear that Adim are coming and maybe they're going to say something against me that caused her to maybe lie. And that's why once we're suspect she's lying, right, we make her take an oath. If we think she's just returning something that no way would she need to return, comes from, right, the other opinion is, what do you mean? There was no way she was going to have to pay anything because the witnesses said she doesn't know anything. So she's really like returning a lost item. And again, once it goes into the category of returning a lost item, we can't make you take an oath because of tikkun olam. No one would ever want to admit something if you're going to make them take an oath. People hated taking oaths. It was like a fear of taking oaths. Okay, that's the complicated part. And now we're going to finish up pretty simple. Darash Mar Zutra. Mar Zutra taught, Mishmei Rav Shimi bar Ashi, Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yosef bar Chama. We pasken on all 7 issues like Rabbi Abba. Amalei Ravina le Rav Ashi. Ravina says to Rav Ashi, "Do Rav Nachman mine?" What about the time when he argues with Rav Nachman? We always pasken like Rav Nachman in laws, in monetary laws. We've talked about this before. Just like we pasken like Shmuel, and Rav Nachman usually holds like Shmuel. It's just known. So how could, in the part about the orphans, how could he, right, goes against? Amalei ein govim matnina la b'chein amar Rav Nachman. This is what I told you in the beginning. They're going to say, oh, it must be. He doesn't think you can collect from the slaves. He thinks you can't collect from the slaves. And what he really said was, the Gemara was telling you, V'chein amar Rav Nachman. And Rav Nachman says the same thing. Okay, and therefore he doesn't argue with Rav Nachman, and therefore we don't have a problem that we rule against Rav Nachman. So then the Gemara is going to ask, well, if he agrees with Rav Nachman, then Hilchat halafu kemai. So in what case was he telling us the halacha is like Rabbi Abba against someone else? And that we're going to get into in tomorrow's talk. So quick summary, we're not going to get into all the cases, but we basically saw with these 7 cases, 7 rulings that Rabbi Abba sent from Israel to Babylonia. And one of them, the 5th one, potentially had to do with the last sugya we saw, again, depending on the interpretation, but the conclusion seemed to be that it relates to that sugya we saw about the father coming against Chazaka in terms of determining who is the firstborn. And that's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day.